Yes, so this talk is going to focus on automating the Center for Internet Security Foundations Benchmark for AWS. This is a very popular framework, and I'm very excited to share this with everyone because I think it's a great thing for new security engineers to get into. So the question that I like to ask everyone is, how do you manage cloud security? We all have different ways of doing it. We have multiple environments, multiple regions, tons of machines, tons of users, and we're bringing in information from all of our backgrounds, all different types of experiences for how we want to monitor these sort of things. So as a new security engineer, how do you even begin consolidating this? Well, I'd like to present this quote here. The unreasonable man adapts himself to the world, or the reasonable man adapts himself to the world. The unreasonable one persists in trying to adapt the world to himself. Therefore, all progress depends on the unreasonable man. So I kind of came across this wonderful framework that the Center for Internet Security released. It has a list of guidelines for securing your cloud environment. And as I started reading through this document, I realized this is a great introduction to security. And for new security engineers, if you're trying to build up your skill in Terraform and you're trying to get started in security in this space, specifically with AWS, this is a great introduction. So there's a bigger reason though too. Why are we doing this? We really need to deal with multiple cloud providers, not just AWS. Another big benefit for the Center of Internet Security framework is that it's applicable to not just AWS, but also Alibaba, Azure. And then when you combine this framework for all these different cloud providers with Terraform, now Terraform is cloud provider agnostic. So you can quickly do this for multiple providers. Once you do it for AWS, it actually becomes very easy to do for Azure and other cloud providers. And other thing is, we're not making something super complicated. It's low-hanging fruit for security and compliance. It's a very basic thing that we can just do. So typically we have tons of users and we're creating these user accounts, and maybe they aren't being managed by a single person clicking around in the console. It's much better to do these in Terraform, and we can do it very efficiently in Terraform as well. There's a whole list of resources for managing users. We can create users, put them in groups, assign them a membership, and then attach a policy. But how do we handle administrator privileges? Everyone has to be an admin. So one thing that I found kind of works, and this is also a recommendation from the framework, is that you create one admin that just has administrator access, and you put their admin privilege right in their policy. And then you attach that policy to a group, and then you only put your administrators in there. So you may have 3 to 4 people who are admins, but they're all going to be managed in Terraform, and they'll have administrator access attached to the group. This is what the policy document looks like in Terraform. I thought that this was a really great thing for me to learn as a new security engineer, because I was able to learn policies and Terraform at the same time by listing out the actions and the resources. I was able to understand how AWS builds their policies, but I did it all in Terraform. Okay, so now that we have a policy, we can just attach it to the group. This is what it looks like. So this is a great way to handle IAM. We just create a policy, a group, and then we attach it to it. We're not putting these on individual users, which tends to be a problem if we're offboarding or onboarding and someone doesn't have access, or they're even worse, leaving and they have access. Now, another piece of low-hanging fruit for security is multi-factor authentication. Right now, everyone's kind of working from home. We're all working remote, and it's very dangerous if someone was able to get a hold of someone's machine and they destroyed all of their cloud infrastructure. Could you even imagine the devastation that that could cause? And we really could do it. It's really possible. So I think it's very efficient to create a multi-factor authentication policy, and you do it in 3 steps. Typically, we have machines talking to machines, and those need to assume role in AWS. But then we also have people who need to talk to machines, and they're assuming role, but they're using the CLI. And then we just have users logging into the console. So if you make a multi-factor authentication policy for the console, that will handle people just signing in. And then when you are managing your assume role, you can leave one assume role policy for just the machines, and then you can create a different assume role policy, which also has this section, this condition for is multi-factor authentication present for the users who are assuming role. Now, when you are dealing with the CLI, this was kind of a new thing for me to get into. I was learning how to use session tokens. So basically you have the AWS credential provider chain. So if you're using Terraform, I believe the first place it's going to look is for a credential file. Otherwise, look for environment variables. But if you have multi-factor authentication attached to your policy, you will need to create a session token. This is one thing I really love, that I keep on finding these little nuggets around in Terraform. Something so simple, keeping complex passwords. It sounds like a trivial thing, but it really is low-hanging fruit. The most common password in the world is just password. So people are going through and they're logging into accounts. We can easily protect ourselves against that by creating a password policy. And this is an awesome resource. I think in the example, this is exactly what it says. Another really great thing about putting all this stuff in Terraform is we can meet a lot of the guidelines recommendations just by adding attributes to our resources. For example, one of the guidelines says that we need to enable server-side encryption for S3 buckets. Well, in Terraform, all we have to do is just set that up. Another example here, we have to enable EBS encryption. You definitely want to have this enabled because we don't want people being able to read this information later. So one of the other areas, we have our monitoring and we have our logging in the CIS Foundations. Logging, specifically, setting up the logging for the CIS is very helpful for small security teams, because once you've done this according to their guidelines, the CIS guidelines, you'll be able to quickly scale up your logging. You'll automate all of the resources for logging, like setting up a central CloudTrail bucket, adding config rules that can be monitored for compliance, and using CloudWatch event rules for monitoring changes. Once you have all those things set up, it's really great because ElkStack actually has pre-built dashboards that you can use to monitor most of the things that you're setting up here. So 3 things that I use the VPC flow logs to look at traffic, trying to see where people are going, where traffic is coming and going to. I also monitor our ELB access logs, and I also monitor our CloudTrail bucket. And if you follow these guidelines and you get it all set up in Terraform, it's really simple to apply this to your cloud, and then you'll be able to use ElkStack to monitor all of this data. And just monitoring all this stuff with 1 to 2 people can save a lot of money and a lot of time. This is an example of getting CloudTrail set up. In this case, we're looking for all management events. We have a S3 bucket that's totally secure and KMS key encrypted, and we can pull all of our data from that central bucket. So a lot of these things that we're using in logging, I tend to use an SNS topic that has a couple of SQS queues, and those SQS queues are set up to be monitored by Logstash or FileB, something from Elasticsearch that allows me to examine those things on a dashboard. Specifically, when it comes to these guidelines that we're using in the CIS Foundations, I like to monitor all of the compliance changes. So we basically create an SNS topic, a delivery channel. Then you need to have a recorder status set up if you are using configuration recorder, and then we have all of our config rules for each one of the benchmarks recommendations. And then you can monitor all these things using CloudWatch event rules. So the CIS will tell you how to set up your alarms and your filters, and then it'll tell you how to set up the Amazon SNS topic for those filters and alarms. You can also link your configuration rules or your config compliance rules over to CloudWatch as well. And then you can either monitor these with an email notification. I wouldn't really recommend that, because if you are using a production system, you'll probably get thousands of emails every hour. I think a more efficient implementation is to just get this connected up to an SQS queue and then monitor those with Logstash. I did run into an issue with the configuration recorder. I had to create a specific IAM role for config. I just want to put this out there because you are probably going to run into this. And there's one of the things that I thought was really great is in the GitHub for Terraform, there's a lot of community support, a lot of people helping out, and I was able to find the solution to getting my configuration recorder set up. But don't be surprised if you do run into issues with this. Now, the thing is, we probably have multiple regions set up, and this is one thing that I think is really interesting. It could be an improvement too, because every single one of these VPC flow logs that I set up for our AWS accounts, I was able to do it because I created an alias for each region. So I'd love to know if anyone else has better ideas on how to do this. But so what I did is I created an alias for every single AWS region. And then I have a module that goes through and it sets up the VPC flow logs for each one of those regions. So every VPC is monitored. It is monitored for each region as well. But to do that, I had to kind of create a list of aliases for each region there. And that's just kind of how I handled it. And it's honestly, it's great information. Having those VPC flow logs, you can see so much visibility. It's really fantastic. So this slide just kind of talks a little bit more about why I did it the way that I did it. We want to enable VPC flow logging, and there are tons of complicated solutions that use AWS Lambdas, but using Terraform, it was really easy. I just used the AWS flow log resource and then passed in the provider, and you can do it for every region. And then once you have that set up, you're able to monitor all of that, and it'll save you a lot of time and money. This is kind of an example of what one of these dashboards looks like. So to a security engineer, this is great. Being able to coordinate where things are happening geographically, looking at thresholds and seeing what the regular usage is and what's an anomaly. That's a big focus right now in security, is anomaly detection. So we really want to know what the thresholds are for daily usage, and everyone's asking for data, especially in 2021. Like I said, we can use AWS CloudWatch event rules to monitor changes in AWS config. I have mine set up for on compliance change. So if I see that an administrator access has been given to a specific user, an inline policy, or just has been attached randomly, I will see that compliance violation. It'll pop up in a log, and I'll get an alert, and I can monitor that. These two resources were very useful. I use CloudWatch filters and alarms to check for people logging in without multi-factor authentication or unauthorized API calls. And when those alarms get triggered, I get a notification that lets me know. So one of the most difficult parts of implementing the CIS Foundations benchmark was handling networking. So basically in the guidelines, they say that you should never have port 22 open to the world, but I'm pretty realistic, and I understand that many of us do actually need to have that open to the world. One way to handle this is to have a specific IP ingress and egress address. So why not put those things in Terraform and specify which IPs can actually connect through port 22, and you'll know for sure, rather than just going around in the console, clicking around and trying to add it. So that's my talk. And I really hope that anyone watching this, if you're a new security engineer or you're someone who's just getting into this, that you see the benefit of having a framework, something that you can kind of use to teach yourself Terraform, AWS, and security all at the same time. It'll help you automate your monitoring, your logging. You'll save time, you'll save money, and plus your team will thank you, because your CISO is going to be able to have all these dashboards they can look at, and it's great information for them. But yeah, that's the conclusion there. So are there any questions?
Awesome. Thanks, Evan. That was actually really interesting. I'm going to, would you mind stop sharing for a second so we can go to Q&A view?
Yeah, sure.
Awesome. So what's really interesting is that are there kind of like CIS approved test suites, so to speak, for an AWS deployment? Like, is there something out there that I can say, let me run this CIS benchmark against my Terraform and verify that this configuration is CIS compliant? Ooh.
I think we lost. I think I lost you for a
second. There we are. Okay, I'll repeat the question. We're good, I think. Let me just make sure. Okay. So is there a CIS benchmark that I can run against my Terraform configuration, or do I have to write that myself?
Yeah, that's a really good question. There are auditing scripts actually, and they're all community driven. So if you search for CIS Foundations Benchmark Terraform, if you just literally put that into Google, you will find tons of repos, people doing the same sort of thing, and the thing is, it gets updated every year. But I would say that once you have the setup, you can then use AWS config to audit it yourself. You'll actually know, because you'll have a passing score with all your config rules. So you can use community scripts, or you can just go to AWS config and then you'll see if you actually meet all of the guidelines.
Awesome. So we've heard today a little bit about policy as code, which is checking the configuration before you apply it. And then there's the remediation part, which is checking after. You mentioned, a couple different, important audit, like logging, et cetera, how to be turned on. How does policy as code versus remediation fit into this picture when you're trying to turn on the VPC flow logs as well as the alerts? Where does this all go?
That's a really good question. And the main thing I want to focus on in this question is enabling multi-factor authentication. Okay, so imagine this. You are telling a bunch of developers that they're going to have to add a step to running their scripts, right? So I think this is an overlooked concept in security. We have to get buy-in from upper management, and we have to explain where the value is in all of this. The steps for that came from talking to my team. I really had to have a conversation. I asked them, I was like, hey, what if I just go ahead and make this multi-factor authentication policy, right? Everything is blocked, and we tried that for the first time. No, that doesn't work. So there's going to be things in the guidelines that you're going to have to learn how to adapt, just like the whole ingress egress with port 22. With the MFA policy, we have machines talking to machines, we have people talking to machines, and then we have people logging in. It wasn't until I talked with everyone on our team that I learned that this is what's really going on. But I never would have gotten there if I didn't have the guidelines or an easy way of testing all of this. And I think that's just where the value was. I couldn't imagine how painful it would be to create this policy in the console and then go through and then verify and then go back and change the policy. Like it'd be crazy. I mean, it was so simple to just write it, plan it, apply it, and then, oh, this didn't work. Okay, I think within 3 hours, we figured out how to do it. But I feel like that would be a week-long process for a security engineer just going through clicking around in the console. You know what I mean? It's just, it's so much. I don't even click around in the console anymore. If someone's like, we got to make this thing, I'm just like, yeah, we'll just do it in Terraform.
Yeah, and I think it's a really valuable lesson in how you communicate, right? And as part of DevOps, we say code is documentation, and yes, that goes to a certain extent, right? Not all code can be documentation, but I think it's a really powerful way to say, okay, here's how we plan our architecture, and from a conformance standpoint, this is what the security should look like from it.
Yeah.
A common question I get, and I've run into is, like, what's too far in terms of, turning on the VPC flow logs and audit logging? Do you have to do it for dev environments? Do you have to do it for every temporary environment that comes up as well?
Honestly, Rosemary, I think this comes from creating a simple test. I think that's a really important part. And I really appreciate that question, because that was something I had to learn, that as exciting as it is to read this document and say, oh, wow, I got all these things I want to add. I wouldn't have even found the document if I didn't say, how do I know if someone disables or enables MFA on their account? That's where that question came from. So I think for someone who's new and they're getting into this, using the guidelines, if you go through and you implement all of it, you'll find those problems no matter what. But if you want to get to the meat of the problem, what I learned after doing all this, it's really, Terraform is this great resource for adding all these things, but it's so important to ask a question of, why am I doing this? I'm doing this to see if people are adding administrative privileges to their IAM. So maybe in that case, you really only need the CloudTrail part, and then you can have a config rule that checks for those configuration changes, and then you can just have an alert. But yeah, I think it really comes back to just having a question of, why am I doing this? And then you start to figure out, okay, here are these other tools that people are talking about in the community, and these are the things that I can do. And take it a step further, ask those people why they're doing it.
Yeah. 1 second, I think we've got a slight tech delay. I'm gonna make sure that we resolve that for a moment.
Yeah, I mean, I'll specifically mention Suite Ops. It's just, Suite Ops is like this little Slack place that I kind of went to, and I said, hey, I'm working on these things. Mm-hmm. There's one guy who's very popular. He always shows up, Anton Babinko, I think.
Yeah, he's one of the ambassadors. So Anton, I don't know if you're still awake, but hey, you got a shout out.
Anton, yes. I never met him like virtually or anything, but he was like, I'd love to know how you do this because it's expensive and I'd like to see, what sort of things you run into. And I mean, he's writing huge projects in Terraform, but that's one of the cool things about Terraform is that it's so versatile that you could come in with no experience and you can start building these things because you can click around the console and figure out how to do it and then automate it. I love that so much. Like my background is in physics, so I would find like a fundamental thing that worked and then I generalize it. And I see that with Terraform, that it's so easy to find these things in the console that work and then I can automate it. And it's a huge relief because, we're very busy in DevOps. It's very hard to go back and make sure those things are still there 3 months from now.
Yeah, exactly. I've definitely forgotten. I've left like Elastic IP addresses out there, like in the ether. That's not a good feeling. I got the cloud bill that came back and said it was expensive. That was pre-Terraform though. So post-Terraform, I don't do it anymore because it cleans it up for me. I think there's maybe one more question. And, you mentioned that this is, some of this you've noticed, right? There's machine to machine interactions. There's user to machine interactions. Have you been able to investigate boundary yet? I mean, are you aware of it?
I'm still working on that. I would say I've found pieces. The first place that I started at was thresholds. I wanted to know exactly how many API calls were being made. Turns out you can't really do that. You can get an average. You find an average that works. And then if you're so many ticks away from the average, then send an alert. If you're not, then you're within bounds. But that's a really enjoyable part about my job. And I'm still working on it. I don't think anyone gets that perfectly. So maybe I have solved it, but it's evolving. Anomaly detection is it's as deep as you want to go.